On a battlefield where courage met despair, the air was charged with tension as the Confederate forces prepared for a bold assault. What happens when the weight of history falls upon the shoulders of a single commander? As Colonel Edward Porter Alexander waited for the signal to commence artillery fire, a deadly game began, where miscommunication and fate intertwined. Would the bombardment silence the Union defenses or sow chaos, sealing the fate of the Confederacy? Join us as we delve into the decisive moments leading up to Pickett's charge, where bravery clashed with disaster, and every decision echoed through time. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to support the community. The signal to begin the artillery barrage would come directly from Longstreet once all infantry brigades were in position. I had been assigned a clump of trees within the enemy's defensive line as the target for our attack, but I mistakenly believed it was the town cemetery. Around 9 a.m., I began adjusting my lines and preparing for the bombardment. Strangely, the enemy responded with only a few sporadic cannon shots, and we chose not to return fire, knowing they could force us to take cover or exhaust our ammunition before our infantry was fully deployed. I can only speculate that they allowed us to complete our obvious preparations because they understood how easily we could fall into their trap. Of Longstreet's 83 cannons, 8 were positioned on the far right to protect our flank, while the remaining 75 were arranged in an uneven line about 1,300 yards long, starting from the peach orchard and extending near the northeastern corner of Spangler Wood. While I was overseeing this task, William Nelson Pendleton offered me 9 12-pound howitzers from Hill's Corps, explaining that they couldn't use such short-range guns effectively. I gratefully accepted the offer and sent for the guns under Major Richardson's command. I placed them in a sheltered position behind the main column, with orders to remain there until called upon, intending to bring them forward as we advanced. A few hundred yards to my left and rear was the artillery of the 3rd Corps under Colonel Walker. This artillery comprised 60 guns spread along Seminary Ridge, extending to the Hagerstown Road, with 2 Whitworth cannons positioned about a mile north on the same ridge. Between these positions were 20 rifles from the 2nd Corps under Colonel Carter. Additionally, 4 rifles from this corps under Captain Graham were positioned about 15 miles northeast of Cemetery Hill. It's important to note that out of the total of 84 guns from the 2nd and 3rd Corps available for engagement, 80 were placed parallel to the enemy's position, rendering 56 of them inactive during this critical moment. This was a significant oversight, as more of these guns should have been placed in and around the town to target the enemy's flanks and create crossfire with the artillery on the west. The Federals had 166 guns ready at the start of our bombardment, and during this period, 10 additional artillery battalions were brought up from reserves, increasing their total artillery to 220 compared to our 172. The formation of our infantry lines took considerable time and was ill-suited to the difficult task ahead. 6 brigades, totaling around 10,000 men, formed the first line. The second line, comprising 3 much smaller brigades on the left, was positioned about 200 yards behind the first line. The remaining brigade, under Wilcox's command, was positioned behind the right column and did not advance with the rest. When they were finally ordered to move, more than 20 minutes had passed, too late for them to provide any meaningful support. Both flanks of the attacking column were exposed, and the left had no support behind it, which meant it would soon disintegrate under enemy fire. No formation could succeed under these circumstances, and it is likely that a lighter formation would have suffered fewer casualties than a denser one. Just before noon, a heavy bombardment broke out on our left, lasting for half an hour. This is often considered part of the preparation for Pickett's charge, but it resulted from a skirmish between Hill's forces and the enemy to seize a house. Hill's artillery was the first to engage in this bombardment, reportedly on his orders, a decision that was unwise, as it wasted a significant amount of ammunition that we would sorely miss in the ensuing battle. None of the guns from our corps fired during this time, nor did the enemy in front of us. When the bombardment finally ended, an eerie silence descended over the battlefield, even affecting our sharpshooters and the rear of the enemy's lines. Throughout the morning, we had heard the sound of Johnson's troops fighting behind their lines. My 75 guns had been carefully positioned and ready for action for about an hour. While the infantry brigades were still not properly in place, I was waiting for Longstreet's signal when I suddenly thought of sending a request for Richardson's 9 howitzers so they could advance a few hundred yards before engaging. However, only after the bombardment began did I discover that those guns had been moved and could not be found. It later became clear that Pendleton had withdrawn 4 of the guns, while Richardson had taken the remaining 5 to find cover after being caught in the Federal bombardment that followed Hill's artillery. I chose not to complain about the situation because I believed that if those guns had advanced with the infantry, they might have been left behind on the battlefield and potentially triggered a counterattack after Pickett's charge was repelled. Meanwhile, about half an hour before the bombardment began, I received a letter from Longstreet that startled me. It read, "Colonel, if the artillery bombardment does not succeed in driving off or weakening the enemy enough to increase our chances of success, I would advise against encouraging Pickett to attack. I will depend heavily on your judgment to decide this matter and ask that you notify George Pickett when appropriate." Until that moment arrived, although I was fully aware of the enemy's strong position, I never doubted that we could overcome it because I trusted in Lee's orders. But now, I faced a difficult situation, having to decide whether to continue with the assault or not. The reasons against the attack seemed very clear to me. Brigadier General Ambrose R. Wright stood next to me as I read Longstreet's letter and expressed my thoughts. It was clear that we would allow the artillery bombardment to begin first, then it would be my responsibility to decide whether Pickett should advance. If we chose against it, we would have to return to Virginia to replenish our ammunition, marking our campaign as a failure. I knew deep down that our artillery alone could not dislodge the enemy. But I still held onto a faint hope that perhaps, with cooperation from Ewell and Hill, things might turn in our favor. Though I had little information about their positions or orders, I asked Wright for his thoughts on our situation. "Is it as difficult to get there as it seems?" He replied that reaching the position wasn't the real issue. He had made it there with his brigade just the day before. "There's a place where you can rest and reorganize," he explained. "The real challenge is staying there once you arrive, as the entire Union Army is concentrated there." At that time, I didn't fully grasp the implications of this. The issue seemed to be one of support, a matter for Robert E. Lee to decide. I had seen several of Hill's brigades forming up to support Pickett, and I had heard rumors that Lee had mentioned a coordinated attack on the entire enemy force. Determined to assess Pickett's feelings on the matter, I went to see him and found him cheerful and optimistic about our chances. I felt strongly that once our bombardment began, Pickett had to be ordered to advance. However, I also wanted Longstreet to understand my perspective on the situation. So I wrote him a note saying, "General, when our fire is at its best, I shall advise George Pickett to advance." Longstreet must have felt deeply distressed by the failure of his hopes to prevent a senseless slaughter, as he was entirely convinced of the futility of the attack. Yet even he could not immediately grasp that Hill and Ewell were not prepared to support this attack or capitalize on any temporary success. None of their guns were positioned to provide cooperative fire or to follow up the attack, and much of their ammunition had already been wasted needlessly earlier. Although Pickett's assault succeeded in capturing enemy guns, there had been no preparation to support him. The entire burden fell on the 10 brigades involved, while 26 other brigades and 56 fresh guns stood idly by. At exactly 1 p.m., by my watch, the signal guns fired, and the bombardment began. The enemy was slow to respond at first, but then intensified their return fire. I felt a sense of urgency that Pickett should attack as soon as I saw our fire having any effect. About half an hour would pass between sending the order and Pickett's column nearing the enemy. I could not afford to use up too much ammunition, more than the amount consumed in 1 hour of firing, since we were far from our supply line and had been fighting for 2 days. Therefore, I decided to send the order to Pickett as soon as the first favorable sign appeared, and no later than 30 minutes after the bombardment began. After 20 minutes, no positive development occurred. The Federal lines had more guns in action than when we had started, and the entire 2-mile length of it was ablaze like a volcano. It seemed reckless to order an army to march across 3/4 of a mile of open ground to face the center of that line on such a hot July day. Yet, action was necessary. I wrote a note and sent it to Pickett at 1:25 p.m. "General, if you are going to advance, you must do so at once, or we will not be able to support you adequately. The enemy's fire had not significantly diminished, with 18 guns still firing from the cemetery. Just as I sent this message, I noticed the enemy's fire suddenly reduce. I saw other guns preparing to withdraw. We often withdrew before Federal guns to conserve ammunition for their infantry. But the enemy had never adopted such measures. After waiting a few minutes and seeing no new guns replace those that had withdrawn, I felt confident that the enemy was suffering heavy losses from our side. At 1:40 p.m., I sent another note to Pickett. For God's sake, go forward quickly. 18 guns have withdrawn. Hurry up as my ammunition will not allow me to support you much longer. This was followed by 2 verbal messages, conveying the same urgency, from an officer and a sergeant near my guns. Those 18 guns occupied the position that our attack was directed toward. I had been wrongly informed that it was the cemetery. Soon after, only a few sporadic Federal guns remained in action, but Pickett's formation had still not moved forward, although it was now just 300 yards from my guns. I later learned what had happened after my first note had been sent. That note reached Pickett while he was with Longstreet. He read it and handed it to Longstreet, who remained silent after reading it. Pickett then asked, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet knew it had to be done, but he hesitated, unable to speak. He turned away and looked elsewhere. Pickett saluted and declared he would go forward before galloping off. Longstreet rode alone to meet me on the left flank of the guns. It must have been about 1:15 p.m. by then. But I didn't check my watch again. My impatience grew as I awaited Pickett's arrival, fearing we would run out of ammunition. When Longstreet reached me, I explained our situation to him. He sternly replied, "Go stop Pickett and replenish your ammunition." I replied, "We cannot do that, sir. The supply wagons are nearly empty. It would take an hour to distribute, and in that time, the enemy will seize the opportunity." Longstreet seemed uncertain. Both of us dismounted as we spoke slowly, with deep emotion about what lay ahead. "I don't want to make this attack. I don't see how it can succeed. I would not act now. But Robert E. Lee has ordered it and is expecting it." I felt he was seeking my approval, and if I had given it, he might have ordered Pickett to halt. However, I was too aware of my youth and inexperience to share my thoughts unless asked directly. So I remained silent while Longstreet wrestled with his inner battle and his orders. The waiting was brief as Garnett emerged from the woods behind us, riding at the head of his brigade. I had served with him in Armid since 1858, and this was the first time I had seen him since Longstreet's campaign. He saluted me, and I mounted my horse to ride with him as his brigade passed our guns. Then, I rode along the line of cannons to check their ammunition. Many were down to canister shot. Those with little ammunition were ordered to hold their position. The guns with enough suitable ammunition were ordered to prepare and move forward. During the bombardment, the reserve wagons had moved from their original position, and the cannons sent there had not returned. Only one gun from the center was ordered forward. But from the right, Major Haskell brought 5 guns from Garden and Flanner's batteries, part of the Washington artillery. Back in the center, I joined a few advancing cannons and moved to a small hill west of the Emmitsburg Road. As we began firing, the troops moved forward to attack the right flank of Pickett's division. Echelon and Haskell soon opened fire from the left front of the Peach Orchard. The attacking brigades were near the Federal lines, and the musket fire was heavy. As we watched, they approached the enemy through smoke and dust. We ceased firing and waited for the outcome. Not long after, the situation became clear as the enemy's fire slackened, and a stream of retreating soldiers ran towards us, pursued by some fire but not as much as I expected. After about 20 minutes of decreased fire, I was surprised to see Wilcox's Alabama Brigade advancing from behind. Wilcox's Alabama Brigade advanced from behind. They had fought with us at Chancellorsville and had recently won at Salem Church. They had been sent to support Pickett, but they were not part of his main column. Now, with everything over, this lone brigade advanced without anyone in command to stop them. They had about 1,200 men, with around 250 remaining from Perry's Florida Brigade on the left. It was both absurd and tragic. They advanced a few hundred yards past our artillery under heavy fire before stopping to return fire from some bushes along a small stream. Federal infantry quickly moved out to attack their left flank. As Perry retreated through our cannons, Wilcox maneuvered around his right and managed to return to our lines at the Peach Orchard. His losses in this attack were 204 killed and wounded. Perry's losses were similar, with some prisoners taken. While Wilcox's brigade attacked, Robert E. Lee rode up to meet me alone, likely something that had been arranged in advance. We were no longer firing but holding our position to prevent an enemy pursuit. I had no doubt that Lee was concerned about this and had come forward to help rally any stragglers if needed. He stayed with us for about an hour, speaking to almost every soldier who passed by with encouraging words like, "Don't be discouraged, this is all my fault this time." He urged them to reform as they reached the cover, saying that all good soldiers were needed now. Lieutenant Calston, my battalion's ordnance officer, was with me as an aide. At one point, a loud cheer erupted from the Federal lines, prompting Lee to ask Calston to ride forward and find out why. Calston's horse refused to move, so someone handed him a stick to encourage the animal. Lee remarked, "Oh, don't do that. I once had a foolish horse like that, and gentle measures work better." Calston soon reported that the Federals were cheering for an officer riding along their line. Lee mentioned that he thought Johnson's division behind the Federal lines might have had some success. Clearly, he had not yet learned that Johnson had fallen back to defensive positions around noon. Lee rode up and asked, "General, I hope you're not too severely wounded." Keir replied, "Yes, sir, I fear they've got me this time." Lee grasped his hand and said, "I hope not." Colonel Fremantle of Her Majesty's Coldstream Guards had also joined our group. We sat on horseback on the hillside behind the artillery, where we could see over the hilltop, though our horses were hidden from the enemy's view. When all the retreating soldiers had passed, and there was no sign of a counterattack, Lee rode off to attend to other matters. I continued to hold the artillery line with a few adjustments until nightfall. There were some advances by Federal skirmishers that we managed to stop with the cannons, sometimes using canister shot in aggressive bursts. Luckily, Federal artillery did not interfere with our position throughout the afternoon. I quietly withdrew the guns one by one to send them for repairs. And by 10 p.m., the entire line of our artillery had retreated to the position where the attack had begun on the 2nd. As the dust settled on the battlefield and the echoes of cannon fire faded into the haunting silence, what price had been paid for glory? The traces of courage and sacrifice lingered in the air, leaving us to ponder, did valor prevail? Or was this a tragic mistake? Colonel Alexander's choices reverberated beyond the battlefield, challenging us to reflect on the burden of command and the fragility of human ambition. As we close this chapter of history, we invite you to share your thoughts. Was Pickett's charge a noble pursuit or a reckless gamble? What lessons can be learned from this pivotal moment? Join the discussion and make your voice heard. For history is not just what happened but what we learn from it.